To this story now. The Competition Commission, or should I say the Commission for Gender Equality, wants government to explain why the poor state of shelters in the country. It's holding public hearings on the issue, and the Departments of Safety and Security, Human Settlements, Labour and National Treasury will appear before the Commission. Now, earlier this year, the Commission found deep-rooted systemic problems, including maladministration and corruption. To discuss this, I'm joined by the Commission's Sixolile Ngcobo, who joins us in studio this morning. Ms. Ngcobo, thank you very much for making the time to talk to us. What kind of shelters, first and foremost, are we talking about here?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. So we are talking about all forms of shelters that take in women who have experienced gender-based violence at home, and sometimes they are also coming with their children. So the sample of shelters that we worked with are shelters that are fully funded by government, partly funded by government, and those that are not funded by government, because we wanted to make sure that our pool of investigation cuts across all forms of shelters that exist in South Africa. And we had shelters picked in 9 provinces.
And how many shelters would a province have nominally?
Yeah, so that becomes a very sticking point, because there's no standard that each province must have 2 or 4 or 5. It just depends. So you find that a province can have 17, another one can have 10, another one can have 20. At this stage, there is no standardization of how many shelters each province should have.
What's the state of these shelters, at least the ones that are managed by government?
For me, for the CGE, what was very important is that the disparities are even in the shelters that are fully funded by the state. So it's not because it's not about who funds. It's about the fact that the shelters altogether, there is no standardization that comes from Department of Social Development, who are the main player in the provision of shelters in South Africa. And then they are partly supported by Departments of Health, Department of Human Settlement, National Treasury, Department of Education, and Department of Labour. So the other ones, they come with specific services, but DSD takes the big bulk of it. So if you were to compare, for example, around the provinces, because for me that would be better, to the comparison. So you find that a shelter in the Western Cape that takes 20 women might be funded for 1 million per year. And then you take the very same composition of a shelter that is funded by government in Limpopo, and they may be getting 700,000. So you ask yourself, it's 20 women, why are there disparities when it comes to the funding itself?
Now, the poor state of these shelters, how does it impact on the victims who take refuge in such places?
So, number one, the issue of safety came very important. It was number one, because some of these shelters, you can actually just jump over the fence and you are inside. So if you are someone who is really convinced that you want to further harm the survivor of violence, you can almost have access. Second, that's
why often these women will go and take restraining orders against such people.
Yes.
So if it's that easy to access the very place where she's meant to be safe.
And then also, even when we are there, you find that there are no cameras to ensure that you know who's coming in and who's coming out. There's not even a physical security guard at the gate. And these are things that should be there, but because the money is so minimal, the first thing the shelter manager is concerned about is, can I feed, clothe, and make these women comfortable? Then these other things become almost like luxuries. But from where we are sitting, they are not luxuries, because the reason why I moved out of home was to seek shelter and safety. So how do I stay in a place where I can also be unsafe? So that was number one. And then another one that was very important for us is the fact that not all shelters are expecting people with people living with disabilities. So you find that there's a shelter where there's a lift that doesn't work, and all the rooms are upstairs. So how is the person supposed to go up? So that's where your dignity is also being infringed, because you now have people to pick you up and take you upstairs. I mean,
just very briefly, so the public hearings that you're going to be holding, when do they start? And we already have counted the number of departments that are going to appear there.
So the public hearing started yesterday, and yesterday we have your National Department of Social Development coming to account for the state of shelters. They were then followed up by the Department of Treasury, National Treasury, and then later in the afternoon we had Department of Social Development Gauteng and Department of Safety, Community Safety Gauteng as well. And then today we are continuing now with provincial DSD departments.
All right.
And we'll run until Friday.
Okay. Now, thank you for that update, Sixolile Ngcobo. She is from the Commission for Gender Equality. Thanks indeed for making the time to speak to us.